Oh, hello, everybody. This is Henry Schneider with the Business Performance Podcast. And today it's my pleasure to speak with Richard Barnett, who's an entrepreneur and sales executive with a passion for delivering solutions to solve real-world business challenges across manufacturing, distribution, and retail industries. So please welcome Richard to the podcast. So, Richard, to begin with, would you please briefly describe LevaData, your customers, and the kinds of products and services you provide?
You bet. Thank you. Yeah, I joined LevaData about 3 years ago, and it's an early kind of innovator in this area of procurement and sourcing. What we do is we apply AI methods and large data analytics to help our customers transform their sourcing and supply management processes with new insights and new agility to drive better outcomes, reducing risks that they may be facing and also reducing overall costs on a sustainable basis. Our customers include leaders within the high-tech, industrial manufacturing, medical devices, industries, and we're expanding into consumer goods. And so oftentimes they're challenged with global complex supply chain across multiple products, maybe hundreds if not thousands of suppliers, and very complex dynamics around lead time, cost, and the impact that raw materials and foreign exchange and trade regulations may have. And so they're under tremendous pressure to have great intelligence and great agility around how to manage that. And that's what we give them.
Okay. Yeah, so that's like you said, it's very complex. So when you think about all that, what's the importance of quality in doing all that for your customer base?
Well, that's a great question. So there's two aspects of that, right? One is that it's the quality of the supplier and the parts that you're receiving, right? So in some industries, that's viewed as kind of, there's a lot of work, a high degree of maturity around measuring and managing quality, and there's always issues around incursion events which happen, but the issues around managing the relative cost, lead time, and capacity related to achieving that standard of quality is really what the more advanced moves are, and that's really where you need a holistic approach. The other part of it is a quality around data and information and processes, and that actually goes hand in hand, because a lot of our customers are challenged with various sources of information that aren't, they don't know how to talk to each other. They don't all relate exactly. They're not super accurate. So for one minor example is companies, engineers might be adding a part or a component which is not critical to the design of an assembly or a product, but it's end of life in 6 months, and they've been using that same part for the last 2 years. They think it's safe, but they don't have the end of life data and information, or it's changed, and all of a sudden they're launching a new product that literally that part's going to be end of life, and they have to do a last time buy of everything in the world that, wherever that part exists, just to support the product transition for the next couple of years. And those mistakes happen all the time, and that's what's really interesting about the complexity of these, the market that we're dealing with.
Yeah, I also imagine too, something like that is where it's off the shelf now, and so but then you get a customer say, I need that part, I can't need it, and all of a sudden now it's custom supported by two guys, and the price goes way up.
Yeah, no, and that's a real challenge, and that requires a lot of good management principles around simplifying the design, using standard platforms, suppliers, et cetera, to minimize the risk associated with the product life cycle. And certain industries like medical devices, for many reasons, have sort of, if you look across multiple industries, they're sort of at this extreme of that problem. I mean, one of our clients had we're telling an anecdote about, they've got a specific sort of equipment that aligns a glove to help a surgeon, manage a robotic sort of remote operation for a procedure. And that glove is unique to that one surgeon, and they make 8 of them a year. But that surgeon does all this amazing work and is, widely regarded in his field, and he's the guy who recommends their devices at that hospital, right? So they do this crazy these gloves probably cost thousands of dollars to make, essentially, each year, but they look at it in the basket of everything else that they're doing. But one mindset would be to say, we're not in the business of making gloves for, one surgeon, right? So we should shift how we do things. So it's all a balancing act, but it is, yeah, that the idea of getting into super kind of one-off custom products and assemblies and support issues is, the long-term costs of that are huge.
Yeah, yeah. Then you got all the engineering that has to go along with that too.
Yeah.
So let's talk about what are two of the biggest myths or misconceptions out there when it comes to quality, business performance, and supply chain management.
Wow, that's a great question. One of them I would, when I'm looking at this through the lens of specifically supply chain. So, as a overall, right, from Deming and, looking at quality in terms of manufacturing process and in terms of design, there's a relatively high degree of maturity. But supply chain as a business discipline, if you will, is really relatively young. I started my career with I2 technologies in the supply chain sort of field back in the late 90s. And at that time, I mean, basically from like 95 to 99 was really the first wave in the United States, less so in Asia and Europe, of really redefining what does supply chain management actually mean. Because, you'd have industry associations that, would say supply chain, but what they really meant was logistics and transportation.
Okay.
And so, this transformation of looking holistically across multiple functions, is really what's unique about supply chain versus, say, finance or, commercial marketing and sales as functions within the company. Because integrated supply chain management, is looking across transportation, logistics, distribution, sometimes manufacturing, supply management, procurement, all of those functions together. And it's how do you synchronize that across those different sort of silos or specializations to have a network or an integrated view. And, there's still a lot of work to be done to achieve new levels of maturity and with that quality and in performance management. And so there's a lot of interesting, it's intellectually interesting because there's a sort of a shared challenge that many industries, companies, et cetera, is that want to achieve excellence. There's roadmaps you have to kind of work through to think about, what are the key moves that you need to make along the way to kind of orchestrate a transformation or get to another level of performance.
Yeah, I think that was all kind of driven when we started going just-in-time inventory.
Yep.
Because the companies were stockpiling all this stuff and it would sit there and sit there and sit there. Right. And they realized that's a waste of space and resources.
Yeah, I mean, there's many drivers for the change there. I mean, one is in the automotive industry, there was the massive competition from Japan, and the US OEMs, started to really focus around removing, lead time, and then also, moving to more of a tier one system integrator model. And then that model, you had both just in time and just in sequence, right? Because, if you've got a seating manufacturer, then you want the seating manufacturer to deliver the front and the back seats in line on the actual assembly operation so that they can be slotted in the right color, leather, treatment,
Right.
Options, whatever. That's just in sequence. So the automotive industry went to an extreme level of integration and orchestration. In other industries, it was a lot less. You had vendor managed inventory, and you had other models like Dell was a real innovator in high tech. Because they were building to order, right? And that was another transformational move, right? This idea of don't build the stock and push a lot of inventory out that then is not used. Build exactly what the customer wants and do it, with a really flexible manufacturing process, and then push a lot of the flexibility to the suppliers to be able to, buffer the right inventory for the mix of what you're actually going to build. Yeah. And the flip side of that in automotive is that they're always build to stock. I mean, you can custom order cars and trucks, et cetera. But the problem is there's, probably somewhere between 800 million to, 800 billion rather to $1 trillion worth of actual inventory that's actually in the global automotive that's sitting on lots. And, it's highly inefficient, right? And so different industries have had their own supply chain sort of transformation driver. And it's usually because of competition or competitive advantage that someone gained really quickly. What we see today is Amazon, right, with next day or 2-day delivery, across their retail function. I mean, that's what's really driving pressure for brick and mortar and other e-commerce retailers to partner or develop similar capability, because now consumers have this crazy expectation, like if I want to order something, I want to get it same day even. And you're like, wait a minute, that's coming from China, right? In a boat. We can't get that same day, right? So how do we solve that problem, right? So it's there's always this innovation going on, and it's really dynamic.
Yeah. So we talked a lot about what your customers are facing, but what's the biggest challenge that LevaData faces when it comes to performance?
Well, we are in what I would call an early stage. We're kind of post-startup, but we're still an early stage sort of software solution provider that is innovating. So we are part of a new wave of doing things. That's applying AI, large data analytics, an AI advisor called Leva that's making recommendations to users. So when you're on the forefront, there's a couple things that are interesting challenges and opportunities, right? One is that you're trying to educate a market that there's this new way of doing things, and in our case, that's educating kind of an interesting group of folks, right? We call them personas, right? We think about them in terms of generally like, who do we want to work with? Because not the whole market's not ready to take on what we do, but there's a good part of the market that is. So part of those are forward-thinking procurement, sourcing, or supply chain executives. Some of those are what we call innovation leaders. They're very proactively looking at the sort of innovation landscape, startups in Silicon Valley, et cetera, and they're looking for these ways to kind of, hey, how do we try things out, right? So that's a group that we want to work with. And then there's like finance and IT organizations that maybe have real business challenges, but don't know that what we do really helps them address the business challenge. So there's a lot of education that we have to do in the market, and you have to do that when you're relatively small and don't have a ton of resources. So that's an interesting challenge.
Okay.
The other part of it is, all this AI stuff, right? There's an expectation that it's just auto magic. You push a button and then the AI brain is telling you what to do. Well, behind the scenes, it's not that simple. There's a lot of training and learning of different AI models and engines, and that just takes time, right? So if you're trying to scale and grow fast and solve really big problems, you're constantly thinking creatively around how do you deliver incremental value now, buy some time to train the AI engine or get them to adopt and use the service, and then it learns over time. So that's kind of the two dimensions of what we look at.
All right. So thinking about what you were saying about finding these visionaries, it seems to me that's going to be in the entrepreneur startup arena, not in the established big megalithic companies, because this is the way we've been doing it for years. We don't need to change. So how do you break through that? This is the way we've been doing it for 30 years. Why should I change?
It's really interesting, right? Most of the companies that we're dealing with and industries that we're working with, say global manufacturing in general, by company, you'll see this different pattern around innovation, right? So some companies have actually, over the last 5-6 years, they've gotten the message around disruption, where it's not about the big eat the small, it's about the fast eat the slow, right? So there's that dynamic, right? And you can look at the number of Fortune 500 companies, that have been delisted or merged or gone out of business, and you only need to look at that to go, wait a minute, we might be pretty bureaucratic and slow because we're really big, but they're investing proactively around creating some space for either investment or an innovation lab where they can partner and understand how to work with smaller early stage startup companies. And there's a huge range of sort of ability and success that companies have in that area, but it's not as bad as it would have been 15 years ago, where you're right, like some of these companies just even if one individual was excited, they didn't know how to get out of their own way to get started doing something. But that's part of the process, is aligning and qualifying. Are they ready? Do they know how to work with something like this? But the other challenge for us is that in general, even the companies that we're working with that are well known to be very innovative in, say, supply chain, with a great vision and multiple sort of years of trying things out and learning and growing and developing new capabilities in this core area of direct materials and procurement, they've actually fallen behind from a relative innovation perspective. And so we've got this kind of double challenge where this function, even in companies that are pretty innovative, is still being left behind. And there's a really interesting sort of exploration around why that's happened. And we're learning that, pattern, like why is that, the case? And it's taken us a couple of years to really kind of crack the code on why that is.
Sure. Okay, so you mentioned before we started about the Cognitive Summit, and so could you share how that is working for LevaData and overcoming these obstacles for success for you and for your clients?
You bet. So early on when I joined LevaData, I realized that, we're going to have to create a space, a conversation. This isn't about us just selling a product. We really need to help kind of facilitate learning and sharing among, kind of a community, right, of like-minded folks. And that community includes, executives at, large global manufacturers, but it could be consultants, it could be other partners that are working kind of in similar areas. And so we created the Cognitive Sourcing Summit 3 years ago, the first one. And it was unique because it really brought together kind of an intimate gathering of fairly senior executives, analysts and others. And it wasn't really about us. It was about bringing them together and sharing their insights. And so some of the presenters were our customers, obviously talking about their journey, their experience. But it also involved, third parties coming in and talking about related topics that weren't directly related to what we do. But it's this intersection basically of, on one dimension, what's the real impact? What's real about this buzzword that we continue to use around AI, and how is it actually being leveraged or used? What are the use cases that are really making a difference broadly in procurement and supply chain? And then another part of it that's really interesting is talent and change management, right? So how do we? There's a real talent gap in this space that we're looking at. It's like a 15 to 20-year gap. You've got these, wizened, gray beards like yourself, myself, or, like very, 20-year veterans. And then you've got kind of a lack of talent development that's happened, and they're trying to play catch up. Yeah. And you're bringing this new wave of folks in, right? And they're like digital natives. And there's this interesting synergy, right, between those two different groups, because if you can get them to work together, it's actually pretty amazing, because the digital natives don't know what they don't know. They're very aware of data-driven and analytics. They don't have to be the relational expert. They don't have years of experience in the market. But if they can pull that knowledge and that understanding with those, sort of senior folks, then you've got a great teamwork effect. So those are the kind of topics that we try to draw out at that event.
Yeah, good. That's wonderful, because a lot of times, young people think old people they don't know what they're talking about anymore. And there's a lot of corporate knowledge inside of our heads that we
absolutely
can communicate and educate and bring along, and so you don't repeat the same mistakes over and over again, which is
that's right.
Einstein's definition of insanity.
Correct. And it's like, how do you take that tribal knowledge, though, that sometimes is in one person's head, or maybe it's in our space, it's like it's on this crazy customized Excel spreadsheet that's been, being modified over 5-6 years, that only they understand how to work and read, and take some of that codified knowledge that they have and some of the behavior, like what we call negotiation levers. What are the actual negotiation levers that they're using? And then if you can model that, then you can start sharing that to other new folks moving in. Like one of our customers, is shifting their global sourcing team from all North American base to split between North America, Europe, and Asia, 3 different locations in China. And that's a huge talent knowledge transfer challenge, because the average professional experience of the folks in China is less than 5 years.
Oh, yeah.
You've got language experience gaps, business cultural issues. So, if you don't have a platform like what we do that allows for this kind of embedding the knowledge that the experts have and then transferring that in context, for the new teams, they really struggle, because there's a real slow learning curve to get to, you can't do it the same way those other folks did it slowly over 15 years, right? The market's not going to give them that time, right? They got to do it in 2-3 years, right, max.
Yeah, I know. I've done a lot of work in China, and I'm out there, and it keeps me young, and then I realize I'm older than their parents.
Right. Yeah, no, I do a lot of travel to China. My daughter, actually, I just took her she just arrived in Shanghai 2 days ago, and she'll be studying at a Duke Kunshan University for 4 years, actually Kunshan between Suzhou and Shanghai. So I'm finding lots of good reasons to support our customers in China to tag along and go visit my daughter over the next couple of years.
Cool. So if you could distill all those lessons you've learned out from the Cognitive Sourcing Summit, what would be the moral associated with that?
Well, I think, broadly from a, if you're thinking about your from an audience perspective, your market and how you go to market, there is this new way of, if you're not already doing it, really thinking about conversations with the community that you're trying to facilitate. That's really the logic around what we're doing with the Cognitive Sourcing Summit. And I think that the way that particularly executives want to engage with the market is is through conversations with peers. They want to network. Their time is incredibly valuable. We don't have a conference culture anymore, and even digital media access is really limited because leading executives are just under so much time pressure that they don't really have that extra time, except maybe on the weekends sometimes, to just go out and learn, right? And so we believe that creating the right space and environment for peer-to-peer in-person communication is just incredibly important in this day and age where we're overloaded by media. More specifically for us, in terms of what we've learned about the event also, is there's a really fine balancing act between talking at the audience and getting interactivity, right? So what we did last year was, kind of the second half of the day after the food coma after lunch was really organized around facilitating kind of workshops where small teams formed, that may not have known each other well, and they would go work on, specific assignments as a team and then come back and share what their table or their group came up with. And that's really magic, when that starts happening, because you're stepping way back and just letting everyone share, really interesting insights. And then, and then afterwards you make it really casual and just allow people to continue the conversation. So I also think that format has been effective for us. And, it's something I think that a lot of conferences I attend don't have that balance right. I was in a panel discussion at a large industry conference I won't name, earlier this year, and they had a panel discussion going on for an hour and 45, 2 hours, in a huge conference room, and no one wants to be in a warehouse staring at a bunch of people talking for 2 hours. Like, I don't know if you do, but that doesn't work for me. And being on the panel itself, it was really challenging to keep everyone kind of engaged, and with it.
I imagine with you sitting up in the front, you're seeing people walking out constantly. There's
no good. Yeah, I look at the phone, right? Yeah.
Yeah, those are, that's, you got just to end up being a bunch of talking heads. And it should be more of you give a little information, let's go off and work this.
Absolutely.
Come back, let's give a little more information, go off and work this. Make it
real. Yeah, I mean, the close I always think is so important mindset-wise is, what's the takeaway? What is the action you're going to take the next Monday, right, when you go back to work? And then what's the action you're going to take maybe in 60 days? That making it, connecting those dots and making what they're learning to, to realizing just those incremental first moves, I think is so critical. And sometimes what we're doing from from market education or from an engagement perspective around these conferences isn't crystallized enough. There's a lot of theory, there's takeaways, but sometimes it's really hard to pull those nuggets, out and then figure out how to apply it. And I think that's, really critical.
Yeah, I agree with you. A lot of times it sounds good because you give very simple examples, and then, okay, I go back on Monday and say, well, wait a minute, my problem is much more complicated than I don't know what to do.
Right. I don't know how to apply what the magic of how those guys did it, but it was interesting, but I don't know where to start, right? That's the challenge.
All right, so what are some of the nuggets of wisdom that you try to impart to your client base so they understand and can embrace what you're talking about?
Well, one of the frameworks that we really started promoting early on was to kind of shift the thinking a little bit, kind of a new paradigm, was this idea of a kind of a loop or circle or even a spiral versus a linear line-based process, view, right? Sequential view of
Mhm.
things, right? So if you look at procurement and sourcing, there's this very kind of process-oriented mindset, which is I might take weeks to go do a category or commodity strategy once a year. I might have a big sourcing event where I'm negotiating with a set of suppliers in a specific commodity, so I'm going to take weeks to get ready for that event. I'll execute the event, and then I update things, right, in my back-end systems. And our point was that there's a new way of looking at this, and it's really a cycle of sensing emerging risks and opportunities on an ongoing, constant basis. Because, you just have to look at the news every day to see what's going on. It's dynamic, right? I mean, we've got retaliatory tariffs and extensions with China. Brexit is still not reconciled in terms of, do we have a no-deal Brexit? Maybe, most likely, but what are the trade implications of that? There's a lot of uncertainty in the markets, right? So the world is a VUCA of all the world, right? We need to be constantly sensing, not going out to market once a year.
Mhm.
And then it's coming up with, like, what are the recommendations for what actions you should be taking? And this is the AI augmentation stuff, right? This is like getting some intelligence being pushed to a professional versus them just using that tribal knowledge and kind of thinking about, what did I do last year or last few years, right? So it's like new ideas around recommendations. And then the idea is to go from that idea of action, from idea to action very quickly, and to collapse that engagement process with suppliers and make it interactive, like, interact not once a year, but as needed with the market and with the suppliers. And then the final key part is learning. So we call it the sense, recommend, act, learn cycle. And it's a simple concept, but if you start actually kind of mirroring what you're currently doing, you actually, it's fairly profound, because there's a mindset of saying it's good enough to just incrementally get a little bit better, but kind of do this very slow linear process. And if you flip that on its head, you actually kind of think about a totally new way of doing things. And so that's really one of the key frameworks that we talk about with our clients.
So that sounds like agile. Agile.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. I mean, decide, monitor, act. I mean, their DCMA framework, for example. There's lots of this is not a new concept around, kind of draws from Six Sigma, Agile, different decision-making frameworks that have been around for a while. But the what's new here is this embedding AI. So it's the learning cycle that's not just the human learning, it's the machine learning, right? Across a ton of interactions, not just, in our case, not just that company, but across the community of all of our customers working on the LevaData platform. There's derived insights from what they're doing. And that idea of crowdsourcing, intelligence, et cetera, is really different. That's new, right? This isn't just about, good project management or good decision-making process. And so, but those principles have been around for a while, right, of how to think about things.
Yeah, so that's very disruptive to these people that have been used to this linear waterfall type of,
Right.
really cycles. I mean, I don't think, can they handle the stress of getting real-time data?
Well, what's funny is that if it's put into context, absolutely, because it needs to be filtered and synthesized. The stress they're feeling is actually the raw challenge of trying to feel overwhelmed externally with new data sources and information sources than we've ever had before, but the inability of any one human to possibly explore and absorb that, and then the pressure internally of key stakeholders from supply chain and finance and sales teams coming to them and saying, give me your best opinion about what's going to happen in the next 3 to 6 months. And that's really challenging. So in one customer case on $3 billion of direct material spend, we did an analysis of all the individual data points that we were actually scanning and looking at. And it was 1.6 million data points that we were actively monitoring to provide insight around that $3 billion worth of spend. And our data science team felt like they were barely scratching the surface around the scope of insights that they were trying to look at over time. I mean, that's the reality of this new world. And, it's almost inevitable that you have to take a new approach to solve this problem, because other competitors are and other companies are, and you've got to catch up. And so there's a real competitive advantage for companies to take this mindset and this approach. But to your point, at the individual day-to-day level, the individual professional does need to think differently about what they're doing, and trust this, relationship to new information coming to them in new ways.
Okay, so let's take a step backwards here and focus on you and your career. So you started out with a degree in political science. So how
Yeah.
do you go from politics into marketing? And what defining moment?
Well, it's really funny. I was always passionate about when I was at school, understanding at that time I was at it was a special time. It was, in the early 90s. So we had just seen the fall of the Berlin Wall. We saw the collapse of, kind of the communist Eastern Bloc and Soviet Union. And we saw this transition from authoritarianism to democracy. And so it was a really interesting, heady time. And so I was really curious about exploring that. Always had a passion for travel and languages and cultures. And so I felt like it made sense. And I actually went on and got a master's degree in international policy studies as well. And I was very good at the sort of domain in the area I was working in, and there were a lot of high expectations from professors and advisors. I started the Stanford Journal of International Affairs, for example, as an undergraduate, which was the first academic publication that sort of had professors, graduate students, undergraduates working together to publish topics on this area. And I was on a fast track, to go into academia, at least go through getting my doctorate or my DPhil. But I just realized, that like I don't want to be in academia the entire time. I got to get out in the world and do something, And a friend of mine had joined a startup in Austin, where I live now. We both do, called Trilogy Software, and I thought that I would just go join them for a year or two, and then go back into my academic career. And it was an amazing experience, just super great set of folks, all very smart, learned a ton. And that experience sort of got, I got the bug, so to speak, around technology innovation impacting industry and business. And that really started my career in supply chain. And, I have no regrets, but it was a why in the road, that took me kind of in a slightly different path. But, professionally, I've been able to live in Japan for 4 years. I've been to 56 different countries. I've still explored, cultures and economies, and I still follow very closely international trade policy and development economics, is part of what I do as part of looking at supply chain transformation. So I feel like I haven't left the field, so to speak, but it's definitely a different path than what I expected.
Yeah, well, the other thing too, which is interesting, is that my opinion or exposure to PhDs, there's two camps. There's the ivory tower, and then there's the practical people. And
Yeah.
you sound like you're in the practical side.
Yeah, as part of what I was doing when I was an undergraduate, is I had a chance to go work for the World Bank in Brazil, at a project in the northern region of Brazil, which was called FUMAC, which was the first time the bank was doing small productivity loans or grants. It's not quite micro lending, but it was sort of for like livestock replacement or tube well irrigation or small productivity enterprises like sewing operations. Very common pattern for what we see now. A lot of kind of developing economies and communities that are relatively poor, and they're we're trying to help educate and provide new resources for them. But it was really groundbreaking at that time. And it was so fascinating because it was like a firsthand experience of seeing all the actual challenges between the hard work it takes to actually go how do you take $350 million, which is a fairly large fund size, and distribute it in $20,000 to $40,000 loans or projects, right? That's a really hard problem, right? And you have, politics at, each of the individual state levels, and you're working through all that. My eyes were open, but at the bank, you had that same challenge. Everyone in Washington, D.C., ivory tower, economists and others that had these theoretical models of social internal rate of return, et cetera. And then I had the firsthand experience of like, the reality is slightly different. I could fudge these numbers to make the internal rate of return look better than it is, but that's not what it's about. It's about relationships and people and organization, project management, and, getting out there and educating, right, these potential beneficiaries around this opportunity. And that's a totally different set of skills. And so I came out of that thinking, yeah, I don't want to be in the ivory tower. I don't want to be in a, kind of a bubble. I really want to be connected to what's really going on.
Oh, great. So, Richard, we could just keep talking forever. I'm really enjoying this conversation, but we're running out of time. So, to wrap things up, how can people get in touch with you to learn more about supply chain and what LevaData does?
Well, happy to engage with anyone who's curious to learn more. My email address is rbarnett@levadata.com. I also am on Twitter. It's Barnett Richard, my name reversed, at twitter.com. And you can also find me on LinkedIn. So happy to engage on any of those channels, and would love to hear your feedback or questions that you might have.
Okay, great. You're a fantastic storyteller, Richard. It's very fascinating. I really enjoyed all your advice and insight into AI and the supply chain, and I'm sure our viewers will be finding it just as fascinating. So thank you
Thank
so
you for
much.
thank you for the opportunity to join you.